small stems, so the error rate isn't too bad. But again, you have no merchantable volume in a small stem. Often your choice is governed by what's available to you. In a reforestation project, you probably have those diameter measurements. A lot of times people don't have that information, they might just have volumes. So usually what I would recommend is if you have the diameter data and you have equations that you feel are suitable, I would go that way. If you're concerned that the equations aren't appropriate, then you might need to find someone to work with to adjust the other method to work for you. Because choosing an equation that's really different compared to the species you have can really be a very large source of error. But I would go with the biomass method if you have what you need to do that. That's what I would always recommend, and that's what I personally do in my research.
And do you think it's more useful if found to measure biomass using the biomass approach? And what if I use like a bunch of equations that have different numbers? Is that like common? And is that a common practice, or am I just producing more and more? Because you just pointed out that relying on one equation might not be very secure in some, so.
Well, that's often what happens is that you might not have. So in the Northeast, there's something we call the Whittaker equations because Robert Whittaker developed them. So they're just called that. And he looked at a bunch of species in New England. But you might have species that Whittaker didn't make an equation. So all of his equations were developed, they have the same mathematical form, and he used the same approach. But if he has a species, I'm just going to say spruce. I don't know if he has one for spruce. Say I have a lot of spruce trees. Well, now I have to go find a spruce equation. And it was probably developed by someone else. And it might have a different mathematical form. That's always going to happen. And the problem is you don't always know how some equations underestimate, some equations overestimate. And so it is quite common to use different equations developed by different people. There's really no way around that. There are compilations of equations, there's BioPath, there's all these things you can find on the web. They are going to behave differently. And yes, that's introducing error. But there's really, the FIA program in the US is working on national biomass equations. We're probably 10 years from having those. But that's one country. I mean, it's a universal problem, and I would just document why you chose that equation and try not to get too far away. Don't use a spruce equation on a pine. It happens. Don't use an equation that was developed on trees up to 40 centimeters dBH for a tree that's 100 centimeters. Just do the best you can, but it is unavoidable that you will have to have a mixture of equations. See, I told you I never tell people what they want to hear.
Yes, so on biomass equations, I've actually developed and used biomass equations. And I think when it comes to selection of biomass functions, one of the factors that needs to be considered, as you explained, is to ensure that you know the diameter range that was used to develop the biomass functions. And you also have two types of equations. You can have a species-specific biomass function, or you can have a generalized biomass function. So if you choose any of the biomass functions for a project that was not used in the development of the biomass functions, I think one key factor, one key thing you need to do is to do a small validation test. So you have a range of equations that you want to, that you are considering. You can chop a few trees and see how the different equations actually work, and then you know the error margin, and you can be able to adjust.
Thank you very much. That's a really important point. So the data for biomass estimation You just need merchantable volume if you're going with the one approach. So that's really simple, and it's often something you'll have. It's very easy to collect. And often this will be stratified, so you might see in the sample data I have, I think they just broke it into broadleaved and conifers, but often people might stratify it by age class, forest type, a number of different things, and then you'll have a volume for that particular class. But it's quite simple and straightforward to apply. And you're probably going to need some, stocking levels are another way to prove it. Biomass equations that we mentioned, diameter, usually height, and species. And again, thank you for pointing out there are generalized ones as well as species specific. If you're concerned about using multiple equations, I certainly don't have any problem using generalized ones, because then at least they all behave in the same way. So yes, there's some error, but you're removing another source of error. And that's usually the trade-off that I take. And you're likely going to need inventory data, because you do need a tree list. You need to know step by step. So just a little bit about forest inventory, and one of the goodies on your flash drives is a publication by the Forest Service that is a very nice basic handbook on forest carbon inventory. It covers inventory design and how you come up with how many plots you need to get the right level of error. I helped with the soil and forest floor section. It covers all the components you need, and it's not really technical. It's very easy to read and apply, and it's a basic reference I like to use for people, and it should be adaptable to use. I mean, obviously in mangroves, you've got a different set of problems, but for most forest types, you should find that to be pretty helpful. So prism plots are something that we'll use in the US, and it's a variable radius plot, but it's a temporary plot. So it's a quick way to estimate volume, but you can't return to that plot again because you can never quite relocate it again. So for most people's purposes, you're going to need fixed permanent plots of a fixed area. And these are often circles with a set radius, because that's the easiest thing to do in the field. Because you're going to need to return to that plot to remeasure it in the future. So we mentioned this is labor intensive and it gets quite expensive, but this is an area where local capacity building can really help solve this problem. You can have community groups, you can have local people who are paid and trained and employed in this as a way of earning a livelihood, and you can also involve volunteers as well. You just need to be trained and periodically check to make sure that the procedures are being followed and it's quality data, but this can absolutely work. We talked a little bit about remote sensing data. This is used a lot. One of the things on your flash drive is a source book from a remote sensing approach, and this is commonly used. It's a good way. Yes? I haven't handed them out yet. I didn't want people to run out before lunch. I'm sneaky.
I'm not going to run out.
I'm sneaky.
I'm happy to be here.
I'm glad to hear that. So remote sensing is great for an initial mapping, kind of figuring out where the extent is and basic forest types. It's great for change detection, to look at land use change, but it is being used a lot as part of the RED readiness to sort of get the basic mapping done. But as a few of us were talking about, there's really no substitute for doing the work on the ground, because you have to, just like when you destructively harvest the trees and you weigh them, that's how you build a relationship from the diameter and the height to the biomass. It's the same thing. You have to build a relationship between what the satellite and the aircraft sees and what's on the ground. So remote sensing is a valuable tool, but you still have to get out there and measure things to build those initial relationships. LiDAR, which is like radar, only lasers, that is becoming more increasingly common. LiDAR gives you tree heights with great accuracy. Right now, it's really only available airborne, so the aircraft flies, collects those tree heights, and people have been very successful in some forest types of building very accurate models to give you the biomass of those stands from the LiDAR data after it's processed. But again, it still requires that you do the groundwork, and you have to very precisely make sure you're measuring exactly what the LiDAR footprint captured. It hasn't been done in all forest types yet, and there are some terrain restrictions as well. Slopes get really steep. the laser starts getting scattered. But it's something you will hear more about, and it holds a lot of promise. It could be a very valuable tool. So I mentioned spatial scales a bunch of times, and our lecturer from Linda Heath, she's going to mention spatial scale as well. This is really, really critical, and this is another one of those things where I wind up telling people not what they wanted to hear. If you're doing an inventory for a national system, okay, so the US has one, Mexico's building one, I know Canada has one, a lot of countries, it's a grid. And so you're meeting an error target to report at a state or national level. So your plots are not going to be dense enough to use those data for our project. And here's an example. This is my part of the world, and I don't know if you can see those little dots. Those are all forest inventory and analysis field plots. Okay, the red ones are Forest Service. That's the National Forest. If we zoom in to just my little neck of the woods, so all those plots looked really dense before, and now you can see they're kind of far apart. There's one inventory plot every 2,400 hectares. There's one plot. So you can see that's really not going to get you off the hook to use those data. You could use them for a state level analysis or a regional analysis, but for your project, you're simply not going to have enough plots. So there's that issue of scale that's always coming up, is the grain of what you need and how many plots. So unfortunately, you usually have to have inventory at 2 levels. So you've got to sort of meet your national obligations, and then your project ones require a different system. It's regrettable. Okay, a little bit about calculations. You can do the biomass expansion factor ones, you can just use a calculator. You can pop them into a spreadsheet. The biomass ones, I just do them in a spreadsheet. You don't really need any specialized software to do any of this. You could create something that might make it quicker, but it's not that difficult. Usually, you'll have to do the roots separately and add them back in. Again, the current IPCC equation just puts it all into one equation. Just a little bit more. This particular paper is on their flash drive. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce their name, but I thought it was a really excellent overview of the 2 approaches. And so I think that's very helpful reading. I had posted it on the web space for this session as well. Also in your flash drive is that volume 4 of the IPCC guidance. And so chapter 4 gives detailed instructions. It'll show you what we're doing in the exercise. It gives you all the default factors. If you don't have your own factors, it provides all of that for you there. And this is sort of the final point. Whatever choices you make, document them and be consistent, because things have errors in different directions. So once you've made your decision and you've documented your approach, you need to stick with it and continue that way. If there's a good reason to make a change, or maybe not so good reason, and you made a change anyway, we've recently changed how we calculate biomass in the United States, and so everything had to go back and be recalculated. If a new equation comes out, perhaps somebody comes out with a new equation and you didn't have access to that before, that's great, but in your previous work, you're going to need to go back and recalculate using the new equation. You just have to remain consistent. So if you need to make a change, that's fine, but document it and go back and recalculate. Otherwise, you may have apparent differences that are just a function of the choices you made at the time and that aren't real. So that's just one of my really big points. Oh, it's time for virtual Linda. So you saw the video of Linda earlier today, and she did have a wonderful experience of 2 years as a secondee to the World Bank. And she has the Global Environment Facility. She has a lot of really interesting things to say. And again, her presentation is not on your flash drives because I didn't have the smaller version of it without the audio. But I do have it with me now, and I can email that to you, or if you have your laptop, I can give that to you at the lunch break if you're interested in having this presentation.
Good morning or good day. My name is Linda Heath. Stop her. don't know if I missed it in your presentation. There's so many situations, at least in my part of the world, where the trees are not growing in a forest context. They're scattered or they're in small plots. And there's combinations of this, including some trees in lines, which changes completely the proportion of trees in terms of the ratio of the ground to the stem and all that kind of thing. That is a real challenge for us. We're not dealing with the forest where you can just get the tree form, apply your coefficient on area, but the density of the trees on a hectare changes on it.
That's something we've actually encountered. I work with someone in the agroforestry area as well as one of our urban foresters. And this trees what we call trees outside of forests. This is a problem they encounter frequently. And we have a set of national equations, national biomass equations, and they've actually found 10 of them, that one of those works fairly well in that situation. They did some destructive sampling, so there may be, you may need to just find something similar to the form and do some sampling to test. They are developing some equations as well, but for the urban, they just evaluated a bunch of generalized equations and found one that seemed to perform fairly well for urban trees. And I believe it's the same with the agroforestry. They found one of the equations. I don't know in particular which one. I couldn't find out, which isn't to say that it would work for you, but they just evaluated a lot of the generalized ones and found one that they felt fairly confident represented the situation pretty well. But I agree, it is a problem. And it may be that you're best served, if you can, to find a partner to develop those solutions. If it's that common a situation, it may be worth addressing. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, but it's a challenge no matter where you are in the globe, that particular one. But thank you for pointing that out.
Good morning or good day. My name is Linda Yee. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service and have recently returned from a 2-year secondment with the Global Environment Facility, working in the area of forest carbon. By now, Jaylee has covered a great deal of useful information about carbon inventories and tools. And so I'm going to talk about my experiences with carbon inventories and capacity building and benefits estimates and climate change mitigation investments. Briefly, I'm currently back in the position of research forester with the Forest Service. For 2 decades, I've worked in forest carbon and greenhouse gas estimation, often linking to forest inventory and analysis data and producing consistent, well-documented, transparent estimates across geographic scales. I produced the official national forest greenhouse gas inventories for the U.S. since these were required in, say, the mid-1990s. And then I would give the estimates and text to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and they compile those into the complete greenhouse gas inventories for all sectors that the U.S. then uses to report to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I worked on developing a web tool of forest carbon estimates that after it was complete, the U.S. Adopted it for a voluntary reporting program. And for the last 2 years, I handed over all this work and instead participated on a 2-year secondment at the GEF as the Land Use Change and Forestry Program Manager on the Climate and Chemicals team, which includes program management duties on the Sustainable Forest Management / REDD+ incentive team also. So just to be clear, I'm speaking today as a Forest Service technical expert based on my experiences as a forest carbon and forest carbon greenhouse gas inventories for all my work there. This presentation will touch on 3 topics, starting with carbon inventories and monitoring, based on my GEF experiences, which includes both development of monitoring systems or capacity building for their development, and the need to have MRV systems, measurement, reporting, and verification systems for projects that fund activities on good management practices to produce forest carbon benefits. So much of the presentation will be based on this experience, which begins by describing the GEF, but becomes more specific, where I actually talk about 2 projects that I was involved in reviewing at some level. Now, there are many other opportunities to look at besides the GEF, and some of these will be described. And finally, I'll discuss important considerations, such as safeguards, ending with a look to the future where I discuss a number of still evolving and sometimes dynamic items that involve forest inventories. Now, the Global Environment Facility serves as a financial mechanism to the so-called Rio Conventions and other multilateral environmental conventions. So these include the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. And although there's ongoing discussion about the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, the GEF is not formally linked to that, but supports the implementation of that protocol in countries with economies in transition. The GEF is located in Washington, D.C. The trust funds are administered by the World Bank, and the GEF staff are administratively World Bank staff, but it is a separate unit within the World Bank with the